Welcome to the class video for Module 4, the first of two modules devoted to Jean-Jacques Rousseau's On Social Contract. In this module, we'll look at some of the broad themes of European history in the 18th century to give you a sense of Rousseau's historical context. And then we'll turn to the text and we'll look at books 1 and 2. The main subject of book 1 is the social compact, and the main subject of book 2 is the authority created by that compact, the general will or the sovereign. Your assignments for this module are to take the Rousseau 1-2 reading quiz, and as always, while you're doing your reading, to be identifying passages that you can use for your concept essay. In particular now, if you identified passages in Locke, you want to find passages on a comparable concept in Rousseau. So if you are thinking about writing on rights, and so you have some passages in Locke about natural rights and the surrender of natural rights at the moment of the social contract, you want to then be looking in Rousseau for descriptions of natural rights and what happens to rights at the moment of the social contract. The concept essay is going to ask you to compare and contrast Locke and Rousseau on a comparable concept. If you are checking off passages and highlighting them as we go through, it will make the work of writing the concept essay much easier when we get to it in a couple of weeks. So let's turn now and look at just a few of the major themes of European history in the 18th century that will highlight some of the themes in Rousseau's writing. Rousseau is a very different kind of character or personality than John Locke. Rousseau's major writings are from the 1750s and 1760s, so some 70 to 80 years after Locke. Locke, of course, is a Brit. And while Rousseau is born Swiss and does live a large portion of his life in France, he is representative of a continental European citizen. He lives in a whole variety of places throughout his life, living off the patronage of wealthy families that want to support the arts. Most importantly, John Locke is first and foremost a politician. He is a member and a leader of Parliament engaged in a revolutionary movement to overthrow a king, and he writes the Second Treatise as a justification for the exercise of that power. Rousseau was never an office holder of any note or importance. He was no military commander. He was not a particularly wealthy person. Indeed, as mentioned, he lives off the charity of wealthy families. But he hobnobs with all of the important writers, thinkers, artists of the 18th century. He's a representative man of letters of the Age of Enlightenment or the Age of Reason. Hopefully you have heard that term before, or one of those terms before. For our purposes, for the purposes of understanding the text on the syllabus for this semester, it's most useful to think about the Age of Reason or the Age of Enlightenment as an extension of the scientific revolution. Whereas the major intellectual breakthroughs of the 17th century were focused on discovering the laws of the natural world, that is, the laws of astronomy and physics and chemistry and mathematics, in the 18th century, intellectuals and philosophers tried to extend that basic insight about the power of man's reason and the scientific method to discover hidden truths about the world, but to focus instead on man's experience and on the laws of human society. If you are an architecture student and have some familiarity with art history, you may recognize the Dutch masters period of the late 17th through the mid-18th century, and one of the things that was revolutionary about that humanistic art was that it focused on the ordinary everyday experiences of normal people rather than what we associate with pre-modern art, that is biblical themes or perhaps themes of epic poetry like Homer, or the portraiture of the nobility and its sort of choreographed iconography, instead portraying people in their everyday events, occurrences, and normal clothes and appearances, and finding that a subject worthy of artistic interpretation. Again, bringing the focus to the human experience. And on the other end of the spectrum, thinking about the laws of human society and human interaction. The 18th century is the origins of modern economic theory, and indeed we call the major economic thinkers of the 18th century like Adam Smith and Malthus and Ricardo, the classical economists. Again, thinking about how people interact, buying and selling things, and can we deduce underlying natural laws that govern that behavior. So too much of modern psychology has its roots in 18th century thinking about what makes people engage in criminal behavior, what's the roots of aberrant psychology or aberrant antisocial behavior. And you may associate pre-modern or medieval punishments with things like the stocks or the dunking tanks or public executions. And all of that is going to be transformed in the 18th and early 19th century, and the development of a science by which a kind of therapy, a kind of medical science through which the penitentiary institution can transform people who have been led into antisocial behavior, that they can be cured and can be returned to the society as kind of normal human beings. That thinking about how do we punish people and bring people back into socially acceptable behavior lays much of the roots of modern psychotherapy theory. So too much of modern biological anthropology has its roots in 18th century natural history and thinking about the relationships among species and their not quite evolutionary relationship yet, but their genus and family and order relationships to each other. The origins of Linnaean taxonomy are in the 18th century, and that of course raises foundational questions about the place of man in the natural order, because we too bear certain resemblances to other species. Is it possible that man is not the unique and sole attentive focus of God? Is it possible that man is simply one species in a world of species competing like other species? And at the root of that insight is what we refer to as natural religion, and that is broadly the idea of deism, or God, if there is such a thing as a God, created natural laws, and then natural laws are what bound the human experience. That is to say, God does not intervene and interrupt the operation of natural laws. Or thinking about religion from an anthropological perspective, that is to say, religion and the study or the worship of God is not observing something external to ourselves, but has its origins within ourselves. And that is probably Rousseau, the subject of what is probably Rousseau's most famous and controversial work, Emile, or On Education, which is a sort of portrait of Emile, a young man coming into maturity and adulthood, and Rousseau reflecting on how human beings learn. How do we come through experience to understand the world? One of the central themes of Emile is that thinking about God, thinking about the nature of the cosmos and the unexplained or the things that we observe that cannot be explained, is sort of innate in all men as a condition of our species. It is natural in man, so that the implication is Christianity is merely one expression of this fundamental human need to explain the inexplicable, to explain the cosmos, what's beyond our understanding, to have a scheme for understanding what's beyond our observation. And so, by implication, Christianity is no fundamentally different than any other form of religion. That is, all religions equally express man's natural, instinctive curiosity about the cosmos and the afterlife. That work earned Rousseau banishment and being declared a heretic by the Catholic Church, and he was driven primarily from Louis Bourbon, France, to Prussia, and we'll talk about that more in the politics of enlightened despotism in the next slide. Although Rousseau was not himself a politician or office holder, he did hobnob with the great and powerful mid-18th century Europe, and his perspective on politics is shaped by a continental experience with politics in the mid-18th century that is radically different than the British tradition from which the Americans derive so much of its political culture. In the development of a modern constitutional order, the institution we like to refer to as the nation state, Britain has a unique experience that is, as much as anything else, the result of an accident of geography. Because Great Britain is an island clearly separated from the continent of Europe, the emergence of a modern state is more or less synonymous with the origins of the nation. The modern British Constitution embodies the sovereign authority of the British people, and the British people are fairly easy to identify. They're the contiguous boundaries of these two islands off the coast of Europe. So in American political culture, as with British political culture, we tend to treat that phrase, the nation state, as consisting of two synonymous things. That is, it's the joining of two consistent things with the same boundaries around them. The state represents the nation. The experience in continental Europe is radically different. Pre-modern Europe, going back to the fall of the Roman Empire up until the 18th and 19th century, is really a patchwork of overlapping kingdoms and dukedoms and earldoms and fiefdoms that are constantly changing, fracturing, and reorganizing. It's an endless stew pot of different political divisions. If you read Machiavelli's The Prince, you got a little bit of a taste of how quickly political boundaries change. Dukes switch sides. There are no stable alliances. Any nobleman with his retinue of soldiers will switch sides to one alliance or another, and that there's no consistent either cultural or ideological ties that bind together any kind of political entity beyond the immediate small cultural group. And the map on the screen gives you just a little kind of frozen snapshot of this endless patchwork and kind of fracturing of political entities. The consolidation, so these entities, these cultural units, are what Europeans more commonly refer to as nations. So the Poles or the Saxons or the Bavarians or the Swiss or the Genoese or the Tuscans, right? Each one of these groups constitutes a nation, that is, a group with a common cultural identity. And the process of 18th and well into 19th century politics is the consolidation of these diverse nations into a single administrative unit referred to as a state. So in European political vocabulary, the nation and the state are two very distinct things. The nation represents the people of Poland or the people of Prussia or the people of Saxony. The state, the political administrative unit, could be very different than that and exists over and above the nation as a kind of neutral apparatus, a kind of administrative apparatus to reconcile the differences among nations. This process of constructing modern nation states then happens not under the umbrella of a democratic revolution and the people of the nation rising up and demanding a state that represents their particular identity, just the opposite. 18th century Europe sees the rise of what are known as the enlightened despots under the ideology of royal absolutism. And you see a whole cast of characters on the screen there of the most famous of the absolute monarchs of the mid-18th century. And these monarchs in aspiring to transcend the particular national identities of the regions over which they govern, transform themselves into the ultimate expression of sovereignty. They are so powerful in their offices that they transcend the divisions among the different cultural groups that are within their realms. So they have a very weak sort of ideological or cultural identity. Frederick II is not merely the king of the Prussians, he is the king of a whole number of ethnic groups that are all united under his transcendent power. This trend is so different than the Anglo-American experience, where it is the breaking up of the claims of monarchical authority that sort of opens the door to a modern constitutional system. The continental experience is virtually the opposite, and so it's very difficult for American readers to understand this as being sort of modernizing or progressive, but it is breaking down those feudal relationships and those ties of feudal loyalty and fealty, and it's replacing it with an abstract idea about this invisible state that is neutral and is transparent, that is fundamentally an administrative function, not a cultural or political function. And these rulers, at least the most famous of them, you see on the screen, get into a kind of competition with each other to see who can be the most progressive, that is to say, sponsoring legislation that liberates common people from the bonds of feudalism and serfdom. And so we find a whole sweep of laws associated with these enlightened despots that initiate religious toleration, that initiate liberal political reforms. And in particular, there's an idea that emerges in the late 18th century that these enlightened rulers can get together and negotiate a kind of system of global law, that is, especially around wars and military aggression, that we need not have endless internal strife because these rulers transcend their cultural identities and their ideological impulses, and they can get together and agree on a kind of world order among themselves and lift Europe out of the endless bloodletting that they associate with the Middle Ages. When Rousseau is thinking about politics, and as we'll see, he's going to put much more emphasis on the power of the sovereign than Locke ever did. Rousseau is thinking about these transcendent characters, these enlightened despots who are so powerful that they transcend the petty conflicts among the people within their nation. And because they are so powerful, they don't have to identify with any one particular cultural group within their realm. They are greater than any particular group in their realm. This is the dominant trend of European politics through the 18th all the way up to the 19th century, where we see the emergence of the nation states that we recognize today. Germany and Italy and Austria and Hungary are going to emerge all in the mid and late 19th century as the culmination of this trend that starts during Rousseau's time period. So Rousseau is just coming from a very different set of conditions, and when he's trying to think about where does democratic authority come from, where do the people get a voice, in what manner are governments accountable to the best interests of the people over whom they rule, he is imagining a world in which there's this transcendent, almost godlike power that exists over the top of everyone. And how do we convince that power that the only legitimacy, the only validity for the power that they exercise is the extent to which they are obligated to represent the people of their realms. So it's a very different set of historical and cultural trends that Rousseau is representing. And so it's common to refer to Rousseau's version of the social contract as the continental social contract. and to refer to Locke's version of the social contract as the Anglo-American social contract. And what that intends to convey is that we have a common political cultural tradition of the social contract, but there are variants of it that are corresponding to different historical trends within a common Western experience. Let's turn now and look at the event that is most closely associated with Rousseau's philosophy, even though he was not around to see it or participate in it, the French Revolution. And here we arrive at the great paradox or irony of Rousseau's political writings. Rousseau lived the life of a kind of aristocratic courtesan. He was a celebrity intellectual and writer who rich people kept around to entertain at their parties. If he had a self-conception, it was as a kind of advisor to kings on how to be enlightened and progressive rulers, to understand that the validity of their power depended upon their protection of their subjects' liberties. And yet his writings become adopted by the leaders of the French Revolution, the most radically democratic and egalitarian revolutionary event in European politics, really to the communist revolutions of the late 19th and early 20th century, and indeed the kind of North Star or compass point for the development of modern democratic institutions in Europe. It is not at all clear that had he been alive, that Rousseau would have, joined the barricades in Paris in the summer of 1789, or stormed the Bastille with the sans-culottes to free the political prisoners. It's not at all clear that he would have seen in the events of the French Revolution a fulfillment of his own political vision. Nevertheless, in a way not dissimilar to those communist revolutions of the early 20th century, in which the leaders of those different Russian and Chinese revolutions sort of competed with themselves, competed with each other to see who could implement the sort of purest, truest form of Marx's political vision. In a similar way, the leaders of the French Revolution devoted themselves to seeing who could implement the most orthodox version of Rousseau's philosophy. This irony or paradox is helpful in understanding the ambiguity of the text when we come to it. We'll see how sort of slippery and ambiguous Rousseau's writings are, and how easy it is to interpret his text as a justification of a kind of maximally authoritarian system. For our purposes here, in placing Rousseau in the context of the writings on the syllabus for the semester, there are really two primary traits of the French Revolution to point out to help us put it in the context with the British Glorious Revolution of 1688 and then the American founding that we'll turn to next. The first trait to understand is just how much more radically democratic and egalitarian the vision of the French Revolution was than certainly the Glorious Revolution, and as we'll see when we turn to the American Revolution next. Think about John Locke and Parliament. Their goal was to purge one king, but then to replace him with another king simply bound by this higher law, the Constitution, right? So Locke does not envision a fundamental change even of the political system, right? He wants to retain a monarchy. He simply wants a monarchy that recognizes limits or the rules of the game or the constitutional law. And as we saw at the end of the second treatise, Locke explicitly rejects the idea that a political revolution necessarily entails a social revolution. The French Revolution was 180 degrees in the other direction. It imagined a complete restructuring of not only the French political system, but its culture and society. A virtual abolition of the role of the Catholic Church, mass land confiscations from both the church and the wealthy and redistribution to the poor, radical gender equality, the abolition of slavery and racial equality. The National Assembly even proposed to abolish the Christian calendar and proposed a whole new calendar based around civic events, a virtual, secular, atheistic governmental system. In its most radical form, the French Revolution imagined they could remake man, that with the abolishing of feudal structures, that a new egalitarian society would emerge, and that our psychology would be different, that we would relate to each other different in this different society. And it attempted to impose that change with military force. But that, of course, leads to the second important trait to understand about the French Revolution, is that it was a failed revolution. That at the very moment of its triumph, that is, first Louis accepts the national constitution, followed by his execution, that the revolutionary leadership descended into what's called the Reign of Terror, which was a kind of a period of mass arrests and executions and a purging of the revolutionary leadership. France descended into a kind of anarchy in 1793 and 1794 that was ultimately replaced by a coup of military leaders known as the Directory. And out of the Directory, a emperor or dictator is going to emerge, Napoleon, who's then going to rampage across Europe and create devastation with wars across Europe for a decade after. So the French Revolution begins with this noble and heroic vision of perfect equality, and it descends into anarchy and ultimately military oppression. It is a failed revolution. And the combination of those two traits is essential to kind of the character that the French Revolution plays in the long history of the development of Western democratic theory. It is a failed revolution because its goals were so noble, because it reached beyond what was achievable. Right? That it envisioned a perfect society, and in the urgency and its zeal to enforce and create that society from scratch, it ultimately led to its own downfall. It aspired too high. It aspired for too perfect a society, and that society was not sustainable and ultimately collapsed. So it raises the temperature question of how radical a revolution can a society sustain? And that becomes then a kind of archetypal or classical question of political science in the modern period. We will want to hang on to that irony as we work our way through the text, and you see the difficulties of understanding Rousseau's interpretation of the social contract. He's trying to describe a kind of perfect harmony among men, a perfectly cooperative nature in what's necessary to make that manifest in the world. But in the course of describing this kind of Edenic state, where everyone intuitively understands what every other person needs and responds compulsively to satisfy that other person's needs, it takes on overtones of authoritarianism or totalitarianism. And that ambiguity is essential to understanding Rousseau's text. It's embodied in the French Revolution as a kind of cartoon caricature archetype in Western democratic theory. So let's turn now to the text, and we'll start with a paradox right in the very first paragraph that really illustrates this dilemma of the French Revolution.